You've heard the Cornell tape, the Betty board. Of course you have. May 8th, 1977, Barton Hall. The Scarlet Fire transition that became the template for every version after. The Morning Dew that had people literally crying. The recording so clean you can hear Jerry's fingers slide on the strings during dancing in the streets. Hear Phil's bass notes decay into silence. Hear the space between the notes. But here's what most people don't know. That tape almost didn't exist. Not because the show didn't happen, and not because nobody was there to record it. It almost didn't exist because in 1986, a woman named Betty Cantor-Jackson couldn't pay her storage bill. And when I say that tape, I'm not just talking about Cornell. I'm talking about more than 1,000 reels. The Capitol Theater shows from February 71, where they debuted Bertha and Wharf Rat and Playing in the Band. The 1978 run that David Lemieux calls one of the best weeks in Dead history. The Cobo Arena show from November 1st, 77, where, and I'm quoting a Deadhead here, Jerry sheds the light, Phil brings the thunder, Weir is on, and the Devils direct masterfully. All of it sitting in a Marin County storage locker. All of it hours away from being sold to whoever showed up at a storage auction with cash in hand. So who was Betty Cantor-Jackson? Betty Cantor was born September 18, 1948 in Martinez, California. She was a kid who took apart radios and put them back together, who excelled at math and science in high school, who didn't quite fit in. Around 66, she moved to San Francisco at 17 or 18 years old, drawn by the music scene. She briefly attended San Francisco State to study sciences, but a literature course shifted her interests. She started going to shows at the Avalon Ballroom, seeing Quicksilver Messenger Service and Jefferson Airplane, getting pulled into this psychedelic hippie movement that was remaking American culture. In 1968, she started an internship at the Carousel Ballroom, which would become the Fillmore West, learning from engineer Bob Matthews. And she met Owsley Stanley, Bear, the sound pioneer, the LSD chemist, the guy who was designing the Dead's early sound systems with this vision that you didn't reinforce sound, you captured it. You preserved what was happening in the room. Betty took that philosophy seriously. She'd later say, I am not sound reinforcement, I am sound. And look, this matters because the context was brutal. The Dead's road crew in the early 70s was, in her words, the world's most macho road crew. She had to carry the same weight as the guys or get laughed off the road, and they weren't inclined to listen to a woman engineer. So Betty developed this strategy. She'd ask what she called dumb blonde questions to trick the male engineers into thinking her ideas were theirs. She told an interviewer, I couldn't tell him because that would not go, because I was a girl. I would play a dumb blonde and ask stupid questions and get them to understand their own self. It's exhausting just thinking about the mental gymnastics required. But it worked. She got the job done. By 1970, she's getting co-production credit on Workingman's Dead alongside Bob Matthews. The album hit number 27 on the Billboard 200, a commercial breakthrough for the Dead. Her engineering helped capture that refined, country-influenced studio sound. But her real work was happening on the road. February 71, Capitol Theater in Port Chester, New York. Betty's recording this run of shows where the Dead are debuting songs that will define them for the next decade. First performances of Bertha, Greatest Story Ever Told, Loser, Playing in the Band, Wharf Rat. The second set on February 18th features a Dark Star into Wharf Rat and back into Dark Star. And it's Mickey Hart's last show before his hiatus. He wouldn't return until October 74. The band wanted these recordings for the Skull and Roses album. They didn't use them, but Betty kept the tapes. She kept everything. August 27, 1972, the Sunshine Daydream benefit concert in Veneta, Oregon. Betty's there with Bob Matthews recording this outdoor show for the Springfield Creamery. The set list includes China Cat's Sunflower into I Know You Rider, a 31-minute playing in the band, Birdsong, and this monumental Dark Star that goes into El Paso. The heat that day was brutal, over 100 degrees, and it actually caused some tape issues that had to be corrected years later when they released the film. But Betty got the recording. Now here's where people get the timeline confused, and it's worth being precise about this because Deadheads will call you out if you're sloppy. Veneta was August 72. The Wall of Sound, that 3-story, 75-ton monster PA system that Bear designed with Alembic engineers. That didn't tour until 74. They tried a preliminary version in February 73 at Stanford University's Maples Pavilion and blew every single tweeter in the system during the first song. The completed Wall of Sound made its touring debut March 23, 1974 at the Cow Palace in Daly City. It required 4 semi-trailers, 21 crew members, and an entire day to set up. By October 74, it was retired. Too expensive, too logistically insane, nearly bankrupted the band. But Betty was engineering shows through all of it, mastering the discipline of reel-to-reel recording while the band was playing. Not in post-production, during. She was making real-time decisions about what the tape would sound like, adjusting levels, creating that sonic signature, what fans would later describe as an even balance of tones, rich fullness in the mix, and sparkling sound clarity. By 76, the band's coming back from their hiatus, and Betty's capturing this tighter, more rehearsed version of the Dead. The June 29th show at the Auditorium Theater in Chicago has that playing in the band into the wheel into playing in the band suite that tapers still talk about. The transfer chain on that one is documented in the archive. Betty's soundboard reel master to beta tape to PCM. That level of care, that attention to the signal path, it's why her recordings sound the way they do. Then comes the year that changed everything, 1977, and this is where the story gets interesting, because the Dead had been rehearsing with Keith Olsen, the producer who'd worked with Fleetwood Mac. Olsen insisted they actually practice their material, which wasn't always a given with this band. So when they hit the road in May 77, they were tight, tighter than they'd been in years. Betty recorded 4 shows that month, New Haven on the 5th, Boston on the 7th, Cornell on the 8th, Buffalo on the 9th. What would eventually become the Get Shown the Light box set on May 5th, 2017, exactly 40 years later. But Cornell was different. The first set includes new Minglewood Blues, Loser, They Love Each Other, Jack Straw, Road Jimmy, and a 16-minute Dancing in the Streets that just stretches out. The second set opens with Scarlet Begonias bleeding seamlessly into Fire on the Mountain, which wasn't a standard pairing yet. This is early in that evolution. And it closes with St. Stephen into Not Fade Away, back into St. Stephen, then into Morning Dew. Betty's recording captured all of it with this clarity that made it sound like you were standing right at the soundboard. You can hear everything, the interplay between Jerry and Phil, the way Keith Godchalk's piano fits into the spaces, Bob Weir's rhythm guitar creating texture underneath. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets complicated. Did Cornell become legendary because it was the best show the Dead ever played, or because it had the best recording? Peter Connors, who literally wrote the book on Cornell 77, makes this point. The legacy of Cornell has almost as much to do with the recording of the show as it does with the show itself. The tape quality shaped the consensus. When that Betty board started circulating in the late 80s, it was the first time most Deadheads heard a soundboard recording this clean. It got duplicated. People made copies of copies. Traders passed it around. And because it sounded so good, because you could actually hear what the band was doing in granular detail, it became the reference point. Deadheads started calling it the best show ever. Not just a great show, the best. And there's this consensus that formed, partly because of the music, yeah, but also partly because the tape made the music accessible in a way that muddy audience recordings never could. Meanwhile, Betty kept recording. The July 78 run through Kansas City, St. Paul, Omaha, Red Rocks shows that wouldn't be released officially until 2016. November 1st, 77 at Cobo Arena in Detroit, which fans labeled a sleeper because it didn't get the hype, but that Terrapin Station Suite is absolutely inspired. The setlist that night. Terrapin Station into Estimated Profit, into The Other One, into Drums, into Wharf Rat, into Trucking. The heady version comments on that show are wild. People talking about how it packs a punch to start the show off right, and how the last third of Jack Straw really smokes. She was building an archive, show by show, reel by reel, using her own equipment, mixing live as the band played. Because technically, these were her tapes. She recorded them on her gear, and she had her reasons to keep recording. Betty married Rex Jackson, one of the crew members. He died in a car accident in 1976. She inherited his share of the band's trust. They later named the Rex Foundation after him in his memory. She kept working after his death. Years later, she was in a relationship with Brett Midland, the keyboardist who joined the band in '79. When that relationship ended, things got complicated. She left the touring crew in 1981 after co-producing the live album Dead Set. But she kept the tapes, her tapes, the ones she'd recorded on her equipment, the ones she'd mixed with her hands in real time during hundreds of shows. She stored them in a locker in Marin County. And then came the mid-'80s. Financial hardship. Betty lost her home to foreclosure, moved to Oregon to live with her in-laws, worked as a nursing assistant, and she couldn't pay the storage fees for her belongings back in California. 1986, more than 1,000 tapes went to auction. Think about that for a second. Hundreds of hours of Grateful Dead performances, multiple shows from the band's peak years, recordings that would later be valued as national heritage. The Library of Congress would eventually preserve the Cornell tape in 2012. All of it sitting in a storage locker about to be sold to whoever showed up with cash. The Grateful Dead organization didn't bid. According to reports, Betty contacted the Dead's office to inform them of the situation. They took no action. Whether they didn't understand what was being sold, or didn't have the money, or just didn't care, we don't know. But they weren't there. 3 separate parties bought the tapes, and here's where the story splits into 3 different paths. The first buyer puts his tapes in storage. They're still there as far as anyone knows, sitting in some locker somewhere. The second buyer was more interested in the road cases that held the tapes than the tapes themselves. He left them in his barn for a decade. By the time someone looked at them, only 6 boxes were still legible. 75 to 80 tapes had no boxes at all. They'd completely disintegrated from rot. A guy named Rob Eaton, who plays guitar for Dark Star Orchestra, eventually helped restore what could be saved. But the third buyers, a couple, they made a different choice. They picked someone to handle their purchase. Ken Gennetti, a longtime Deadhead, a friend of theirs who knew the music. Genetti went to their house, opened a closet, and saw what they had arranged on a shelf in order. He said later it was like opening King Tut's tomb. First tape he saw, Port Chester, New York, February 18th, 1971. Mickey Hart's last show before his multi-year hiatus. Genetti said, "You've got to be kidding me." Next tape, Kezar Stadium, San Francisco, '73. His favorite show he'd ever attended in person. And Genetti and this couple made a decision that changed Dead history. They decided to tree the tapes, get them copied, get them into the trading network, break down the hierarchy where certain tapers hoarded their collections and refused to share with people who were just starting out. Genetti organized copying and distribution, got the tapes circulating, and suddenly there were these soundboard reels showing up in the trading networks with Betty's mixes. And later, when the internet changed everything, transfer specialists like Charlie Miller started digitizing those reels and uploading them to the Internet Archive, making Betty's work available to anyone with a connection. Her balance, her clarity, and Deadheads, who'd been collecting audience recordings for years, muddy, crowd noise, someone yelling during quiet parts, suddenly they're hearing the band the way Betty heard it at the soundboard. People started comparing versions. The China Cat Sunflower from this show versus that show. The Playing in the Band from Chicago versus the one from Veneta. Debates started forming about which performances were definitive. The Cornell tape hit the network. an extra chill review later explained, the 5/8/77 show was the first time that one of Betty Cantor-Jackson's soundboard recordings made its way onto a tape. That tape was duplicated countless times and spread like wildfire among the community. And because it sounded so pristine, clean 1977 Grateful Dead with standout definitive versions, it became the entry point for new fans. People would say, if you want to understand the Dead, start with Cornell 77. Not because it was objectively the best show they ever played, any Deadhead will tell you there's no such thing as a single best show, but because the recording quality let you actually hear what the band was doing. Peter Connors points out that it took until the mid-90s for many of the Betty boards to fully surface. The distribution was slow, almost organic. Tapes would appear in the trading network, get verified as Betty boards based on their sound quality and the distinctive warmth of Betty's mixes. And suddenly that show's reputation would shift. Shows that had been considered good became legendary once the Betty board circulated. The Cobo Arena show I mentioned earlier, it got reevaluated when the Betty board hit the network. Same with the July 78 run. The sonic quality changed how people heard the performances. Eventually, the band's archivists figured out what had happened. David Lemieux, who runs the Dead's vault now, the guy behind Dave's Picks, the successor to Dick Latvala's Dick's Picks series, got his first Betty board tape as a teenager in 1988. Cornell 77, naturally. He wore that tape out. Years later, when he's working for Rhino and the Dead's organization, he started pushing for official releases sourced from Betty's master tapes. It took negotiation, money, time, but between around 2014 and 2016, more than 350 reels of Betty's recordings made their way back to the Grateful Dead vault. May 26, 2016, July 1978, the complete recordings, 5 shows from that Red Rocks and Midwest run, all sourced from Betty boards. Rolling Stone called it the first official release sourced from Betty boards' master recordings, and noted that 78 was one of the best years in the Grateful Dead's 30 years performing career. The sound quality was a revelation. May 5, 2017, gets shown the Lightbox set. The May 77 shows, New Haven, Boston, Cornell, Buffalo, restored from Betty's masters using plangent processes transfer, mastered in HD CD, limited edition of 15,000 numbered copies. The package included Peter Connor's book about Cornell 77 and detailed liner notes. The sound quality was revelatory even for people who'd been listening to these shows for decades. You could hear details that had been buried in generations of tape copies, the warmth of Betty's original mixes, the space she created in the sound field. 2012, the Library of Congress added the Cornell 77 tape to the National Recording Registry, recognizing its importance to American culture. And Betty, she came back to recording in 2011. She was asked to stage manage Wavy Gravy's 75th birthday party and benefit concert. The Chris Robinson Brotherhood played. Betty loved the band and insisted on taping their future shows. Those recordings turned into the Betty Blends series. She told an interviewer that capturing sound is my euphoric thing. At 76 years old now, she's still working as engineer and production and road manager for the band and for the choir at Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco. Still doing live sound, still carrying her weight. Here's what stays with me about this whole story. If Betty had paid that storage bill, or if the Dead's organization had shown up to that auction and bought those tapes, or if Genetti and that couple had decided to keep them private, the entire landscape of Dead fandom would be different. The shows we talk about, the performances that define the band's legacy, the tape trading culture that sustained the scene for decades and created this community of people obsessed with comparing versions and debating set lists and analyzing transitions. All of it depended on a foreclosure and a longtime Deadhead who opened a closet, saw Portchester February 71, and recognized immediately what he was looking at. Betty Cantor-Jackson did revolutionary work in live sound recording. She fought sexism on a daily basis, mastered a technology that most people didn't understand, captured some of the best performances in rock and roll history with a level of clarity and warmth that became the gold standard. And her reward was financial hardship, losing her archive to a storage auction and watching the tapes she'd made get sold off to strangers. But the tapes survived. They got copied. They got shared. They shaped how an entire generation hears the Grateful Dead. When you listen to that Scarlet Fire transition from Cornell, or the Morning Dew, or the Dancing in the Streets, you're hearing her work, her mix, her decisions in real time about balance and space and clarity, her understanding that capturing live music isn't just about pressing record, it's about preserving a moment, creating a sonic document that lets people who weren't there understand what was happening in that room. The Dead's legacy as a live band isn't just about Jerry Garcia's guitar playing or Phil Lesh's bass innovations or the way the band could improvise for 20 minutes and find their way back. It's also about the woman behind the soundboard, adjusting levels in real time, making split-second decisions, preserving what would have otherwise disappeared into memory and myth. And it's about a deadhead named Ken Gennetti who could have hoarded those tapes, could have tried to sell them back to the band for a fortune, could have kept them as private treasures. Instead, he got them copied, got them circulating, made sure that everyone who wanted to hear the Dead at their peak could hear them the way Betty heard them. That's the story of the Betty boards, not just about the tapes that almost vanished, about the community that saved them.